Today on Inside Medical Malpractice, we're going to talk about a very timely subject for the spring and summer of 2020, and has touched thousands of us in one way or another. And what I'm talking about is the COVID-19 infections and deaths in long-term care facilities across Canada. It's a difficult and highly emotional subject with some very widely divided opinions. In fact, just last night, hot on the news was a senior executive in long-term care housing that was dismissed after she failed to turn off the audio on her laptop following a town hall meeting where families were expressing their concerns about care at the Woodbridge Vista Care Facility. She allegedly mocked the crowd and called them, and I say this allegedly, some blood-sucking class action lawsuit people. It's a tough time. It's a tough time with strong opinions. Like so many other people, my own connection to this is very personal. I happen to be the medical decision maker for my husband's 90-year-old aunt. She helped raise him after his own mom died when he was just 3 years old. She died of an aneurysm. She's very close to the family, and she was placed in a long-term care center in December of last year. A little bit of the backstory here is that we had toured multiple care homes and had to pick our top 3. And the one that she eventually got into was our third choice. It isn't necessarily the one we wanted, but it was suitable for location and where it was. So that's just a little backstory. And then what happened in April of this year is we got the phone call that COVID-19 had been found in that care facility. And I clearly remember exactly what I was doing on that day and that moment that I got the phone call. I was sitting on the floor of my daughter's house, reorganizing her kitchen pantry, putting the soups in some kind of order, when that phone call came in. And literally my heart just stopped for a second because I thought, well, this is it. This is how it's going to happen. And it's going to happen with her all alone. Because of course, with the discovery of the first case, also came the lockdown of the long-term care facility. But fortunately, in this particular facility, only 4 people were affected, and they were all staff. There wasn't a single death, and the spread of COVID was completely halted in under 2 weeks. But based on my own situation, what's been happening across the country, and maybe still happening, although we don't know how the trajectory of this COVID infection or reinfection is going to go in the coming months. But what's been surprising to me is what a struggle it's been to sort out my emotions. On one hand, I feel so lucky that my aunt didn't die and we weren't affected by death. And even while I feel lucky, and as I say that word, I fully understand how fully inadequate it is to call anybody in this situation lucky in any way. I also feel horrible for the hundreds of families, the thousands of families that have lost loved ones and been affected by this. And also, as a nurse, I feel grateful that it was the staff that was affected. I know how infection is spread. I know institutions and how quickly it can happen in a place like that. So I feel grateful and some kind of relief that it was the nurses and the care workers, the support workers who were affected and not the frail residents. But while I feel grateful and relieved, I feel terrible. As a nurse myself, I feel horrendous for them and the way their lives and their families' lives have been affected. It's baffling for me to feel lucky and relieved and horrible all at the same time. And I've been wanting to talk about this for some time because it's psychologically somehow disturbing. And I understand that I'm not alone in this. I mean, some might say the ability to hold 2 opposing truths in your head at the same time is a highly evolved way of thinking. But a psychologist might say that's a psychological disorder, like a cognitive dissonance of some kind. So I wanted to open up this conversation because I know if I'm feeling this, so many other people are. But I wanted to present this from the perspective of patients and residents and their families. But I've been waiting for the right time and the right person to have the conversation. Because for those of you who listen to this podcast, you know that it's critical to me that I maintain a level of respect for both healthcare and law, which is tricky to do in some of these very highly charged emotional situations. But when the news came out that Gary Will, a lawyer from Will Davidson law firm in Toronto, was leading one of the biggest, if not the biggest, class actions lawsuits against long-term care centers, I decided to reach out to him and get in touch to learn more about this class action and about the allegations behind it. During our very first conversation, Gary explained the background of multiple issues in long-term care, not just the COVID infection or the issues with COVID-19, but some longer-standing issues with staffing and allegations of neglect and abuse, problems with management that had started years ago. As with many things, the issues are complicated, and they're layered, and they're interconnected, and the timeline starts well before the crisis hits. But what really sold me on Gary Will was during our first conversation, he said to me, as far as I'm concerned, the nurses and personal support workers in this case are as much victims as the residents. And with that, I thought, here's the guy that I want to tell this story. Because my heart is with healthcare. My other heart, the other half of my heart, is a family member who's dealing with the same issues and has the same concerns as everybody else does. So here we have the right guy that we're going to talk to today. I'm welcoming Gary Will, a lawyer and managing partner from the law firm of Will Davidson, LLP in Toronto. Will Davidson is currently representing the families impacted by the tragedy at Orchard Villa Long-Term Care and Retirement Centre in Pickering, Ontario. Gary has been recognized as one of Canada's premier legal experts in the area of personal injury litigation. He's certified by the Law Society of Upper Canada as a specialist in civil litigation. He has extensive experience in personal injury, product liability, professional negligence, insurance, environment law, bad faith law, and class action litigation, which is what we're going to talk about today. He's appeared at many levels of the Ontario court system and is working with another partner in the firm, Gordon Marsden, and Michael Reed, a senior law clerk, on this particular action. So welcome, Gary. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I listened to your opening comments with a lot of interest, and obviously this has had a great emotional impact on you, this whole issue. Thank God your aunt is fine. I haven't had any personal experience with tragedy within my own family, but I feel over the last 4 months, I've talked to well over 100 family members of people who lost loved ones in long-term care homes. And what they are feeling were some of the same sentiments that you were expressing. Some of these people have lost not just one parent, but both parents. And what a tragedy. It's hard enough to lose one parent at a time, but to lose both in such a senseless way, because these deaths were avoidable. And I do consider this to be probably the most important piece of litigation that I've been involved in my 35 years of practice. I feel very strongly about this, that these people deserve answers. There has to be a responsibility and accountability and justice for these families. And when you commented about that senior executive who was caught on mic talking about these class action chasing victims. I mean, that is so disturbing to hear that. Thank God that person was relieved of their responsibility, because this is a true tragedy, and there's no need to insult these people even further.
Well, thank you for your comments, and we're going to hear a lot more because when I spoke with you in the first 5 minutes, you taught me more about this particular class action that I had any idea existed. So I think everyone's going to be very interested to hear not just what's going on at Orchard Villa, but how it perhaps is representative of a much bigger problem in many other care centers. So before we start, the audience for this podcast includes the public and nurses and doctors and lawyers. And for those of us who are not legal, can you talk to us a little bit about what constitutes a class action and what's the difference between a class action lawsuit and a medical malpractice lawsuit?
Okay. So what a class action essentially is, it's an aggregation of a large number of claims of people who are similarly affected, and they're all aggregated into one action and proceed forward in a combined action. So when you look at a place like Orchard Villa, there have been around 80 deaths at this facility. So each one of those estates would have a claim, and the family members of the lost loved one would also have actions that they could bring on an individual basis. Now, in Canada, the sad reality is that the value of an individual case is extremely limited. I mean, most people would be shocked at how low the compensation is for those cases. And that's one of the reasons that we're bringing a class action, is to allow people who have been affected access to justice. That's what it really comes down to, is access to justice. Our firm was first approached by a family in early April. This was before it was such a big issue. And we looked at that claim and had a discussion with the family. They lost a loved one, and we talked about what the potential value would be and what the cost of litigation would be, because I'm familiar, by the time you get your experts lined up, the cost of that was going to be disproportionate to this one family going forward with litigation. So we decided we weren't going to pursue that claim. Then as the weeks unfolded, we got more and more calls, and we got calls from multiple families from the same facilities. And we started looking at it and investigating the matter, and thought that these cases did have merit, and figured out that the only strategy that made sense was to pursue a class action. And that's what we've done. So what you need for a class action is you need somebody to be the representative plaintiff. And in the case of Orchard Villa, it's Sylvia Lyon, who lost her mother at Orchard Villa, and she is the representative plaintiff. If the claim gets certified as a class action, then the case will go forward, and Sylvia Lyon will represent all of the families that are affected. So the 80 other deaths, the estates of those residents who passed away will be part of the class action. The family members, so each of the family members, the sisters and brothers and children and grandchildren, are entitled to pursue an individual claim. So all of those members would be included in the class action if it's certified. And once it's certified, there's a notice that goes out to class members, and then class members can decide, do I want to remain in the class? You do nothing. Or you can opt out. You can say, I want to pursue my own claim, and I want to have my own lawyer represent me. And everyone is entitled to do that. But if they don't exercise the right to opt out, then they are a part of the class, and the case then proceeds forward. And once the case is certified, it proceeds fairly along the same lines as an individual action. You'll have examinations for discovery, you'll have exchange of documentation, and then in a class action, you have what's called a common issues trial. So this is an issue that will be common to all the members of the class, and it's usually liability or causation. And that matter will proceed to a trial. And then if there's a positive finding on the common issues, then you get down to the question of individual assessments, and that can be done through arbitration, mediation, or you can have separate adjudications of those issues. But that's how a class proceeding goes and is distinguished from individual claims.
So a couple of questions. Thanks. That was a great explanation, number one. A couple of questions around that. You mentioned causing some causation and the common issues. Do you have to deal with the same legal principles as malpractice, where you have to prove duty, negligence, injury, and causation? And my second question, you also mentioned getting experts to provide opinion. In a class action like this, what types of experts will you use, and how will you use them?
So the first part of that question is that the legal issues that you face in a class action are exactly the same as on an individual claim. Class action is only procedural. It doesn't create any substantive rights. So you do have to prove duty, breach, damage in the same way as an individual action. There are going to be a large number of experts that are going to be required, and it's going to be around the issue of standard of care largely. What should these large long-term care facilities, what should they have done, and then and contrast that with what they actually did. I think the standard of care is reasonably straightforward. It's really a question of common sense. What do you do to prevent infection? I mean, it's not any great secrets. We've known this, and certainly the government did put out guidelines very early on in this whole process. And the problem was, some long-term care homes, they followed the procedures and got very good results. The vast majority of homes, and I want to emphasize that, have zero infections and zero deaths. In Ontario, we have over 600 long-term care facilities, and 80% of them have zero infections and zero deaths. And it's really a small number of large facilities that account for the vast majority of the deaths. It's 15 or 20 facilities that account for the vast majority of the deaths in this case. So it is known what should have been done, and it obviously wasn't done. And that's what we've been told by family members and, quite frankly, by staff members that have come forward and have told us that they just were not provided with the adequate resources to respond to this COVID crisis. The other thing that you mentioned in your opening remarks is that we're not going after the nurses or the PSWs on an individual basis, because, quite frankly, most of the families we've spoken to are very complimentary of the individuals that were looking after their parents. This really comes down to systemic neglect. And quite frankly, the staff members are as much victims as the residents. So many of them have been infected, and some of them have died. So this is really a question of senior management at these larger for-profit homes to the largest extent, because they have the biggest problems. We're not providing their staff with the adequate resources to look after these very vulnerable individuals.
Two things I just want to comment there. More of the backstory about my aunt was our first choice long-term care facility, which she didn't get into because a bed came available elsewhere, ended up with a serious infection. More than 100 staff and patients or residents were infected, and 20 died, and they are now the target of a class action against, surrounding the management of COVID. I'm going to refer to a CBC article I read, investigative report in June of 2020. They published an article that said 82.5% of deaths in Eastern long-term care centers occurred in the for-profit long-term care centers. And I'm bringing that up now because you mentioned the for-profit sector. And 17.5% only in the not-for-profit sector. Now, multiple variables aside, such as the availability of testing, the accuracy of reporting, even the very definition of what constitutes long-term care, could you discuss, in your view, what's behind the discrepancy in the for-profit versus not-for-profit breakout?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen overall in Ontario and probably throughout Canada is that there's been a big move in recent years of a few big, large multinational corporations entering into the long-term care facility. In Ontario 10 years ago, most of these long-term care facilities some were family run. In fact, Orchard Villa, which we're going to talk about, was run by the LaFontaine family prior to 2015. And people that we've talked to were very complimentary of previous ownership, that they looked after their families in a very dignified manner and were providing excellent care. In 2015, Orchard Villa was sold to Southbridge. It was a large American company that decided to move into Canada and operate a number of long-term care facilities, including Orchard Villa. And what we've heard from family members is that since that date, there was an emphasis, or what management was seeking to do was reduce costs. And there was so much focus on reducing costs, never reducing the fees at the same time, mind you, and that the quality of the care was almost immediately affected. And if you look at a place like Orchard Villa, the complaints then started shortly after 2015 and increased right up until the beginning of this year. So Orchard Villa, we know, was investigated 65 times by the Ministry of Long-Term Care. They spent 42 days at Orchard Villa between 2016 and 2020. Investigating and reporting. And all of these reports are on the Ministry of Long-Term Care website and are available. And they were finding serious deficiencies. So there was a number of warnings given. And I think the number of warnings, was 60 warnings, number of notices of compliance, and a few matters were referred to the director. So this facility was having serious problems even before COVID. And it seemed that the corrective action was never taken because the problems continued. Rather than respond in a positive fashion to the areas that were criticized in these reports, it wasn't. So the same problem arose over and over and over again. And so this place was not ready for COVID when it did occur. And Orchard Villa is not the only place. So there's a number of long-term care facilities, and it's usually the larger for-profit facilities that seem to have had the biggest problems. And I think from what we're hearing from families is that the emphasis was on reducing care as opposed to increasing care, reducing the level of care and increasing the level of profit, because these facilities we know are highly profitable.
Yes, it's big business. There's no doubt about it. So when I read through the statement of claim, I was interested to hear that Extendicare, in particular, the company who purchased Orchard Villa, had some issues in the United States. Could you talk to us a little bit about that before we move forward onto the specific allegations in this case?
So Extendicare itself has a very interesting history, and they were a large provider of services to long-term care facilities in the United States prior to 2014. And in 2013, the Department of Justice launched a claim against Extendicare. And the basis for the claim was that they claimed that the services that were provided by Extendicare were so deficient that they were essentially worthless. And they brought the action for the return of the fees that were paid to Extendicare by Medicare and Medicaid. And as part of that lawsuit, they were joined by a number of state attorney generals who also brought their own separate claims. And then in 2014, Extendicare resolved the claim by paying a record fine. They paid a $38 million fine. It was the largest fine in the Department of Justice history under this False Claims Act. And also as a part of that settlement, they were required to enter into a corporate agreement that they would provide proper services and those services would be monitored over a 5-year period. So that was in October of 2014. In November of 2014, Extendicare sells all of its homes in the United States. They sell it for $870 million. And they take that money and they move into Ontario. They were already in Ontario at that point, but they made a big investment into Ontario, bought up a lot of homes, and then entered into agreements to provide services at other homes. So Southbridge, which had bought the home in 2015, brings Extendicare in to manage the home at Orchard Villa. And they describe Extendicare as a leading, healthcare provider of services. They don't mention the guilty plea and the record fine that they had just paid months before to the Department of Justice. But they were brought in and they were managing Orchard Villa from that time forward and still are managing it today. And they obviously didn't do a very good job with Orchard Villa, because almost at the point that they took over, the large number of complaints to the Ministry of Long-Term Care started. And of course, the disaster which occurred as a result of COVID. And Orchard Villa has the largest number of infections and the largest number of deaths of any long-term care home in Canada that I'm aware of.
So let's get down into the specifics of this class action. Talk to us about the specific allegations against Orchard Villa. And I'd be interested to hear too if the issues here, the allegations that have been forward, might be representative of the, you said there's a certain percentage of homes that had terrible outcomes and others that had 0 cases. I'd be interested to hear if you feel like the allegations against Orchard Villa are representative in other care homes, if it's a wider spread problem than just this facility. But let's start with, what are the specific allegations against Orchard Villa?
All right. So the specific allegations are numerous, so I'm just going to really deal with the major problems as we see them. And the problems that Orchard Villa experienced are common to other facilities. And so the first biggest problem is identifying and then isolating those residents with COVID. So they were slow off the mark with respect to both. They failed to do adequate testing to determine who had COVID and who didn't. Once they determined that someone did have COVID, they didn't isolate those people. And so we have a situation where a lot of these facilities, they had shared roommates. So there'd be 4 residents within the same room. So if one of the residents had COVID, you would think as a matter of common sense, you would remove the person with COVID, but they didn't do that. So they left that person in the room with the 3 other individuals who didn't have COVID. And sure enough, as would be expected, it spread. You would think, just as a matter of common sense, that you need to remove people that are infected to prevent them from infecting other people. They didn't do that. So that's a big problem. We also believe that a lot of the infections occurred as a result of staff members bringing it into the facility. And so there was inadequate monitoring of their own staff and testing their own staff to ensure that these staff members did not have COVID. And of course, if a staff member brings it in, it can quickly spread then through to many other very vulnerable people. Another big problem was just a lack of adequate PPE, lack of gloves and masks and, personal protective wear. Staff, and we've heard this from numerous staff members, they were expected to not change their gloves because they had to preserve them. So they were going through their shift using the same gloves, not changing their masks. It's very well understood that you do have to change it in order to prevent spread of infection. So that just wasn't done. They didn't have adequate protocol in place. And most of these homes did a good job of keeping family members out of the homes because, a lot of them had announcements that, as of mid-March, no more family could visit, but it was the staff members that were bringing in the infection in many cases, and it was the lack of identifying those that had COVID and isolating them that resulted in the spread of this. And in the case of Orchard Villa, I think the number of infections was well over 200. And this is in a facility where there's 300 beds. So most people were infected. And unfortunately, 80 died at Orchard Villa.
It's a tough scenario to even imagine, as a family, I'm looking at this from 2 sides, as a family member and a nurse. And I've talked to both nurses and doctors across the country that have worked in the midst of the long-term care scenario. And, some people may have heard it in a previous podcast. One nurse was on her 14th 12-hour shift in a row and 60 people had quit. And management was doing the best they can. Everybody was sick. And just the conditions I can't even imagine what the conditions would have been for residents and staff in that setting. So just back again to some of the logistics of a class action. You mentioned briefly that damages or compensation for people in this situation was very small, so the class action makes sense that you gather together a lot of people and you follow one action with a representative plaintiff. And the damages sought in this action are in the multi-millions, and you can perhaps tell us exactly how much that is. But can you explain, as a lawyer and to members of the general public, how you arrived at that number and how that money will eventually be distributed?
Okay, so the amount that's being claimed in this class action is a total of 40 million. It's 30 million for compensatory damages and 10 million for punitive damages. And I must say that at the outset of a lawsuit, it's difficult to predict, what the total damages are. And I admit that it may sound like a very large figure, but you have to consider that it's in the context of 80 people dying. So part of the class action would include the estates of those 80 people. It would also include all of their family members. So, some of these families, they have children and grandchildren and brothers and sisters. And sometimes there's, 12 to 15 family members that are eligible claimants under the Family Law Act. So all of those members would be part of the class action. And some of these people would have claims that are restricted to their loss of care, guidance, companionship, but others may be undergoing grief counseling, and there may be a cost associated with that. So those claims would be included. Some of these people may lose time from work as a result of the grieving process. So those claims would be included. All of the funeral expenses would be included. And so it does add up. As a further part of our class, it's not just the individuals that passed away that would have claims, but we are claiming for anyone that was infected. So there were residents that were infected, and just like your aunt, some of them did recover, but they would have claims for pain and suffering and loss of enjoyment of life during the time that they had their infection. So those individual claims would be included in this class action as well. And finally, we are also claiming in our action that the other residents who didn't die and weren't infected, but the stories that we're hearing about their care or lack of care during this COVID crisis is shocking. And some of these individuals were not fed, they weren't hydrated, sometimes for days. They were left in soiled diapers, sometimes for days. They didn't receive adequate care whatsoever. And for those individuals, we're claiming that you should get a refund of the rent or the fees that you were providing to the facility because you didn't receive value for those fees. And so we're claiming also as part of the class action the return of those fees for those individuals. So once you aggregate all those claims, it can add up to a large sum, but we won't know until the end of the lawsuit what the exact amount is. And the final thing is, we're not only claiming compensatory damages, we're claiming punitive damages. So punitive damages are to punish wrongful conduct. So we say that the actions of the defendants in this case were so reprehensible and so capricious and arbitrary that they're deserving of punishment. And what we rely on for that is that they were told over and over and over again to clean up their act and get proper procedures and protocols in place, and they just weren't doing it. And we say that conduct is deserving of punishment, that over and above the compensatory damages, you have to pay what's called punitive damages. So that's also included within the $40 million.
When you say defendant, you're talking specifically about the Southwood Care Group, the Southwood Care Homes, correct? Not the nurses or the doctors but it's the owner when you say compensatory. I mean, I'm sorry, punitive damages, apologies. You're talking about punitive damages against Southwood Care.
Yeah, so it's against both Southbridge and Extended Care. So those are the two defendants that we've named. Southbridge, as the owner of the facility, has the responsibility, and then Extended Care, who was actually managing it, and we're saying both of them are responsible, equally responsible for the lack of care that was provided and the disaster that occurred.
Got it. Sorry about I had that confused there for a minute, but it's the large corporations, I guess that's what we're talking about, the large long-term care corporations.
Exactly.
I can only imagine already that there will be some significant challenges in moving this action forward. You mentioned, firstly, getting it certified as a class action in the courts. I've certainly heard talk of potential good faith immunity, which would excuse long-term care centers and their employees from any legal action due to the fact that they were deemed an essential service provider in the midst of this crisis. I have zero doubt that you will be facing a vigorous defense from the insurers or companies that will be defending the care provider. And I can only imagine that the level of accountability that a family is hoping for in this situation to achieve through litigation might be very different from what a government might be willing to do or will do in the form of inquiries and investigations and and offering new recommendations and guidelines. But that's just my view. You're knee deep in it and you know this better than I. So talk to us about the obstacles that lie in the road ahead and how you plan to overcome them.
All right. So you mentioned legal immunity, and I think it was about 6 weeks ago that the government was floating the possibility of passing legislation providing immunity to a large group of potential defendants. Now, must say, beyond that initial floating of the idea, there's never been any legislation. I certainly haven't seen any legislation, nor do we know how widespread that legislation would be, and who would be protected and who would be denied access to the courts. When we issued our claim, we issued our claim on May 25th, so we issued it at the court on the 25th. On the morning of the 26th, the Canadian military released their report, and you'll remember when that came out, it was shocking allegations of 5 homes in particular, of which Orchard Villa is one. And that was the very day after we issued our claim. And then on the afternoon of May 26th, Doug Ford went in front of a press conference and expressed how shocked and dismayed he was at what he had read. And in fact, he said during the press conference that it was so disturbing to him that he didn't actually sleep the night before. And he talked during that press conference about the need for accountability and responsibilities in these long-term care homes. In fact, he said he was referring a matter to the coroner to investigate. And this is a death at Orchard Villa, and we're aware of the particular circumstances of the case. And he said that matter would be fully investigated by the coroner, and that matter might be referred to the police and the Crown Attorney's Office. That might occur in the future. He also said that we need to get to the bottom of what occurred here, and he promised a public inquiry of some sorts. We're still waiting on the details of that. But during that same press conference, he talked about accountability, and responsibility. And he talked about justice for these families. And he said that at least 3 times during the course of that press interview. So I would be extremely surprised if that same individual, Doug Ford, was to now come forward and say, long-term care homes are now immunized. It would be shocking if that were to happen. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be totally irresponsible and the wrong thing to do. And if that were to occur, there would be an immediate battle. We would fight that legislation tooth and nail. We'd put every resource behind defeating any such legislation. And we would continue that fight in the courts. The other thing that is a principle that's well accepted in Canadian law is that legislation is usually, when you pass legislation, it's with a view to going forward. It's very unusual that legislation would immunize conduct retroactively. So we've issued our claim. And when the claim was issued, there was no immunity. And it would require a very highly unusual set of circumstances to ever justify any kind of legislation on a retroactive basis. And if not saying it's impossible, because anything can happen, but if that were to occur, we'd have a major battle in the courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada if necessary, because government can't or shouldn't be allowed to immunize conduct retroactively.
Interesting stuff. What about the issue, or what are you anticipating as a defense? Or can you discuss that?
Yeah, well, we haven't yet received any defenses, but I would imagine that they'd come forward and say, well, this was totally unexpected. We didn't expect this. We weren't ready for this, but we shouldn't be criticized for not being ready for this. And this was beyond our power to do anything about. So that's what I expect that they're going to do. And I think there's 2 quick responses to that, is that there's no secret to how you should respond in these circumstances. I mean, it's not the first time, we've had infectious disease. We had the SARS tragedy which occurred, and that was certainly a learning experience. There was, I think, 40 people died as a result of that. But we certainly knew about that and how to respond to that adequately. And the other response is that, we're not going after homes that had good practices and protocols. Like we're focused on the homes that didn't have. And I think the standard of care can be, quite easily established with these 90% of the homes that didn't have a problem, didn't have any infections, didn't have any deaths. If only those practices and protocols had been implemented in all of the homes, then this could have been largely preventable. And that's really the focus of our case, is that this could have been prevented, because there's no big secret to what you should do. I mean, it's really a matter of common sense, and they just didn't do it.
An interesting part of this, because I'm with you on the common sense page, and I've said to anybody who had listened to me in the last 4 months, if I was in charge of this, if I was king of the world, there's just, my practicality would say we're all going to be really safe, and here is exactly how we're going to do it, and just based on those common sense things that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think as mental health care professionals, we know how to operate in a high-risk environment without getting infected and not infecting other people. So, but I think what was really a different aspect of this was believing that this was real, believing that it was a real threat. And the response times, and some people still don't believe it's a threat or a thing, that much of it's made up, or we should just all get it and that's the end of that. But it's kind of a complicated layer on top of this. People saying, oh, it's just the flu, versus, okay, we have to take this seriously and shut it down before it gets anywhere. But I mean, that's a whole other subject we could talk about the way this was handled. But it was news to me when I read the statement of claim that the guidelines and recommendations had been put in place long before the first infection showed up in this long-term care home. So I don't even know what to say about that, not passing judgment on anybody or anything, but the knowledge was there, and I can see how you'll use that against any defense otherwise. Time-wise, I know this is maybe the unanswerable question of the day, but time-wise, pardon me, time-wise, how long do you expect or hope it will take to resolve this action? And considering the age of the people who may not live 2, 3, 5, 7 years, as some lawsuits can take, how do you expect this will go? And historically, how long does it take for class actions to resolve?
Yeah, so as you know, our justice system is very slow, and it's slow even on individual cases. I act in medical malpractice cases where a single family suing a doctor, those cases can take 3, 5, 8. We just finished a case in our firm where we had the case over 10 years before we had the trial. Class actions don't speed up lawsuits. If anything, they slow them down. But I can tell you that we will be pushing this case as quickly as we can, because for our clients, they are aged, and they deserve answers, and they deserve justice. And I truly believe that justice delayed is often justice denied. So we will be pushing the matter, but we require cooperation. So the first level of cooperation is with the defendants, and we have to have a common desire to move this matter on with the defendants. And often they don't have the same interest in moving it on. Their foot may be on the brake constantly and seeking to delay it as long as possible. The other area of cooperation is from the courts, and right now the courts are closed, so nothing is moving in the courts right now. The courts will eventually open, and I think that's going to be fairly shortly. But there is such a backlog that then needs to be dealt with that I think that is going to delay these actions, which are new actions, because they have to clean up all the old actions. And so a lot of trials got delayed from the spring and the summer, and they need to be dealt with. So the very quickest, I think, is 2 years. But if the matter has to go to trial, it's going to be longer than that, because the delay in getting a trial date can, in the Toronto area, be 2, 3, 4 years just to get a trial date. So, of course, if the defendants are interested in resolving the claim, I mean, we're always willing to sit down with them in a constructive manner and try to resolve the claim. So that's an open possibility as well. But I think we're in for a fight.
You might be. So time-wise, 2 years to 12, 20, 10.
Oh,
but it's going to be a while.
I don't even want to think about that.
Okay. Just wondering, to give people some sense. So based on, this is kind of a two-part question, but I'm interested to hear your hope or your goal for the outcome of this action, Because certainly based on past reports, recommendations, warnings, and less than perfect compliance on behalf of long-term care facilities, and less than perfect, perhaps, oversight and accountability on behalf of the government, can you comment on what your goals are and hopes for the outcome in this action, and how hopeful you are that that change will come?
Yeah. So, when I've talked to my clients, family members of residents who passed away, I always ask them that question. Well, what are you hoping to achieve out of this lawsuit? And I can tell you that almost the universal answer I get is I want answers. I want there to be some accountability. And I really want there to be some positive change, because I don't ever want to see another family have to go through what we've gone through. And I would say that is, in 99% of the cases, is the answer that people give. People aren't really focused on compensation. They want to see some positive change. And I can say for myself, I would like to see some change in the industry going forward. I think it's shocking, how we've dealt with our parents and grandparents and people that gave all their lives and are at a point in their life where they can't look after others, but require looking after themselves. They're very vulnerable individuals, and they're entitled to a better level of care than what they've received. So one of the goals, for sure, is for there to be positive change going forward. And that maybe has to be as a result of government. I mean, only governments can change the system. And Doug Ford did promise that there would be an inquiry, and as a result of that inquiry, hopefully there's going to be recommendations, and that will be something to change the system going forward, so that it's better for all of us. Of course, as far as the litigation is concerned, the only answer that we can provide to our clients is that some level of compensation. And I think these people deserve compensation, and I'm hoping to be able to provide it to them in a timely manner. But for sure, what's really driving it is these families want to see positive changes going forward.
Of course. And so many of us, the baby boomers and the end of the baby boomers, that we're all looking at our future as well, of course. And there's a fascinating read, a book that I just finished by Dr. Atul Gawande, and it's called Mortal Beings, or Mortal Being. And I don't know if you've read it, Gary, or anybody listening, but it's very specifically on the subject of end-of-life care and long-term care. And it's a newish concept in our world, just in the 70s and 80s. And we don't quite have it right on 1,000 different levels. So I think many of us have a very vested interest in improving the system, because it's likely in our future as well, in many of our futures, and then what our families will be dealing with as well. Damn it. Just want to say that.
Well, I can tell you within our household, both my wife and I have had talks with our girls about, what's going to happen in the future. And we've made both our girls promise to always have an apartment in whatever home they're living in for their elderly parents if we should ever require it. So we have secured promises by both of our daughters, who are 23 and 26 right now,
right,
that we will be looked after in the long term. And that might be part of the answer, is that people should be looked after within their own homes, but there are always going to be circumstances where that's really not viable. And so we are going to have to look at institutional care for some people who are severely disabled and do require a high level of care. But we can do much better than we have. We need to do this for everybody's benefit in the future.
I agree, for all of us. But certainly, on the flip side of that, a huge shout out to the people in the facilities and the workers that do provide care to our family members. I'm so grateful. And even in the care facility where my aunt is, where there were some issues, I just tell them every time I speak to them, thank you so much for doing the best that you could under these difficult circumstances. And, I'm not at a point in my life where I could have managed the medical issues that I couldn't have brought her home and kept her at home for 4 months. She needs a lot of care. But anyway, that's also another subject we could talk about forever, the ideal long-term care facility and what I want it to look like and what you want it to look like and whether or not our children are actually going to take us in when the time comes. Excuse me. But I think, we could talk a lot more about this, but I think this is a fantastic overview with a lot of insight into a tragic situation, a very difficult situation, like I said, that's very divided and emotional. But I don't want to leave necessarily on a scary or difficult edge. I always think that problems like this have lessons to be learned. And I'd love to hear from your perspective, Gary, the answer to the question, in your view, what is the most valuable thing that we can learn from this? And if you would please answer that from the perspective of the healthcare provider, and then the perspective, well, let's just start there, and then I'll ask you the next question. From the perspective of healthcare providers that are going to have been caught in this, what's the most valuable thing that they can learn from this COVID long-term care class action?
So I think the biggest lesson for members of the healthcare community is that if you see a problem, you need to act on it and you need to report it. Now, the first level that you report it to is your employer, so your immediate supervisor. And if you're seeing a problem with the level of care being provided in the long-term care facility, you report it to your supervisor. If you don't get the proper answers, then you go to the higher level of authority. And if you don't get an answer, then there's avenues. You can report it to the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. And there is a process for investigating those complaints. And I think you owe it to the residents of long-term care facilities, because they often can't speak for themselves. And many of them have severe problems, and you can't rely on the family to always speak on behalf of the residents. So I think the real advocates for residents of long-term care facilities are the staff and the nurses and the PSWs. And you really have a duty to come forward and take corrective measures when things are not being properly looked after. We've received a lot of calls from nurses and PSWs who are now reporting on what was occurring, and this is very helpful information for our lawsuit. And I think what might have been very valuable were maybe some of these complaints, if made at an earlier stage, could have been investigated and corrected before we had this major disaster. So I think that is the biggest lesson, is that if you're seeing a problem, report it immediately. You owe it to the people that you're looking after.
Thank you. Good advice there. What about for the general public? What can the families and the public and those of us that are eventually facing the potential of long-term care ourselves, what can we learn from this action?
So I think for the general public, this whole affair has been a great awakening. I think it quite legitimately, for a lot of people, wouldn't have had any information of what was occurring in our long-term care homes. And I speak from my own personal observations. I don't know anybody in a long-term care facility right now, unfortunately. And so I certainly was not aware of what was occurring. But now, as a result of all the investigating that I've done, I've got a good level of knowledge. And I think as a result of a lot of the publicity that has been focused on this issue, now the general public knows about this issue. And I think the real message is we can't forget about this. You know, we've got to do something about it. Everyone knows now. The politicians know, the media knows, the public knows. Let's really do something about it, fix it as a problem, so it's fixed for the benefit of everyone that's going to need those services in the future.
Also great advice, because often after a crisis like this has passed, it's just out of sight and out of mind, right? And the recommendations, the actions, and the fervor around making change disappears. So I think that's really great advice for the public. We also have a lot of lawyers listening in. Do you have any comments or lessons or learnings for them surrounding this action and the COVID-19 outbreak?
Yeah, so I'm going to address it mainly to plaintiffs' lawyers out there. There are many that may never have taken a case against a long-term care facility. I think the lesson for those lawyers is that it is a tremendous fight that we're involved in. We need all hands on deck. If you've never done a case before, maybe you should consider joining the fight, because these people are very deserving of our attention. It's our parents and our grandparents who've given so much to this country, and now at a point where they're extremely vulnerable and need our help. We as a legal profession, we should step up to the plate and make sure that these people are looked after. I do consider that this is the most significant piece of litigation that I've been involved in my 36 years of practice, and I intend to take this fight forward and make sure that there's something positive that happens as a result of all this. But there are many deserving individuals out there, and my message to other lawyers is join the battle for these very deserving individuals, and let's get justice for these people.
Well, there you have it. I want to say thank you so much, Gary, for the generous sharing of your time, your energy, and your insights into this action. The story that you shared with us, you know, as you've called it, is a tragedy, but speaking with you has been a pleasure. And, you know, your knowledge just exudes, and competence just exudes from you as I look and listen to you. If you are a nurse or a personal support worker and or a family member that had issues with COVID before March of 2020 at Orchard Villa, Gary's an easy guy to find. His name's Gary Well. He's managing partner at Well Davidson in Toronto. He's very easy to find online. You can just see his name and his company name right there. You'll get in touch with him. Please don't hesitate to contact him if there are issues. And if you haven't heard it already, be sure to listen to the shorter podcast with Gary Well, which is titled Learn More About Gary Well. It was really interesting to learn more about him as a person and a little bit about what he's made of that allowed him to be one of the handful of people who's taken on this case that he's describing as the fight of his life, or one of the most important cases ever. Because there's only a few people that will even tackle this kind of a challenge, so there's more to learn. So thank you so much, Gary. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure to join you on this very important topic.